January 17th, 1945. The pre-dawn mist clings to the runway like a veil, and through it the silhouettes of giants emerge, row upon row of Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses, their polished aluminum skins slick with condensation, their 4 Wright Cyclone engines ticking as they cool. The smell of high-octane aviation fuel mingles with the damp earth, and the ground crews move between the bombers like priests tending to steel cathedrals. Each fortress bears scars, patched holes from flak, replacement panels hastily riveted, nose art depicting everything from pin-up girls to avenging angels. These machines have carried young men into the burning skies over Berlin, Schweinfurt, and Regensburg. They have returned riddled with bullets, trailing smoke, landing on foam-covered runways with dead engines and dying crews. And yet here they stand, ready again, invincible in the cold morning light. To the men who flew them, the B-17 was more than an aircraft. It was a fortress in the most literal sense, a flying castle that promised protection at 25,000 feet, where the air was thin enough to kill and the cold could freeze flesh to metal in seconds. It was the embodiment of American industrial might, a 10-ton declaration that democracy could outproduce tyranny. By the war's end, Boeing, Douglas, and Lockheed had manufactured 12,731 of these heavy bombers, each one requiring 400,000 individual parts, 13,000 man-hours of labor, and the resources of a nation that had transformed itself into the arsenal of democracy. The B-17 had become the symbol of American air power, the weapon that carried the strategic bombing campaign into the heart of the Third Reich. But symbols, like men, do not survive wars unchanged. 18 months later, in the summer of 1946, that same airfield tells a different story. The runways are silent now. The control tower stands empty, its windows dark.
And the B-17s, those invincible fortresses, sit in long, neat rows, not as monuments to victory, but as inventory awaiting disposal. Their engines have been drained of oil. Their gun turrets, once manned by boys barely old enough to vote, now hang open and lifeless. Weeds push through cracks in the concrete where their shadows fall. The question that haunts these silent fields is simple and brutal. What do you do with 12,000 bombers when the war is over? The answer would prove more complex than anyone imagined, and it would reveal a truth about modern warfare that the generals had not fully anticipated. That victory itself creates a kind of aftermath, a reckoning not just with the defeated, but with the instruments of defeat. The story of what happened to the B-17 Flying Fortress after the war is not merely an account of metal and economics. It is a meditation on transformation, on how quickly the essential becomes expendable, and on the strange mathematics of abundance that turns saviors into scrap. To understand why so many B-17s were destroyed after the war they helped win, one must first understand what they represented during that war. In 1935, when the prototype took its first flight, the very concept of the heavy bomber was revolutionary. Military theorists like Billy Mitchell and Julio Douay had argued that air power alone could win wars, that fleets of bombers could bypass ground forces entirely and strike at the industrial heart of enemy nations. The B-17 was designed to make that theory real. 50 caliber machine guns, and, most critically, fly in formation with hundreds of other bombers, creating a defensive box of interlocking fire that could, in theory, fight its way through any opposition. The theory was tested in blood over Europe. Beginning in 1942, the 8th Air Force began daylight precision bombing raids against German industrial targets. The losses were catastrophic.
On the August 17, 1943 raid against the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt and the Messerschmitt plant at Regensburg, 60 B-17s were shot down out of 376 dispatched, a loss rate of nearly 16%. Another 100 came back so damaged they never flew again. The wreckage was scattered across Bavaria and Belgium, and the bodies of young Americans hung in their parachute harnesses from church steeples and forest trees. Yet the raids continued. More bombers were built. More crews were trained. The production lines in Seattle, Long Beach, and Tulsa ran 24 hours a day, and the B-17s kept coming, an endless stream of aluminum and American resolve. The men who flew them developed a relationship with these machines that bordered on the mystical. Second Lieutenant Robert Morgan, pilot of the Memphis Belle, the first B-17 to complete 25 missions over Europe, later wrote, "She was more than rivets and metal. She had a soul." Navigator Harry Crosby, who flew 37 missions with the 100th Bomb Group, remembered the sound of the engines differently. 4 rights make a right. That's what we'd say. The B-17 became, in the collective memory of the air crews, not just a weapon, but a companion, a protector, the difference between life and a frozen death in a German field. This emotional bond was reinforced by the bomber's reputation for toughness. Stories circulated of B-17s returning to base with catastrophic damage, tail sections nearly severed, entire nose sections blown away, wings pierced by hundreds of flak holes. One famous photograph shows a B-17 from the 94th Bomb Group that collided with a German fighter. The entire vertical stabilizer and rudder were gone, yet the pilot brought it home. Another, nicknamed All-American, had its fuselage nearly cut in half by a collision, yet remained airborne long enough to reach base.
These stories became legend, and the legend became part of American identity. The B-17 could take punishment that would destroy any other aircraft, just as America itself could absorb losses and keep fighting. But legends, even true ones, are expensive to maintain. By May 8, 1945, when the war in Europe ended, the United States Army Air Forces possessed the largest aerial armada in human history. There were 12,731 B-17s alone, plus thousands more B-24 Liberators, B-29 Super Fortresses, and medium bombers. The infrastructure to support them was equally vast: airfields across England, France, Italy, and the Pacific, supply depots containing millions of spare parts, training schools that had taught hundreds of thousands of men to fly, navigate, bomb, and maintain these machines. The cost had been staggering. The B-17 program alone consumed roughly $3 billion, equivalent to nearly $50 billion in modern currency. Each individual bomber cost approximately $240,000 in 1945 dollars, or about $4 million today. And now, suddenly, they were no longer needed. The military planners faced an unprecedented logistical problem. The United States could not simply keep flying and maintaining 12,000 heavy bombers. The fuel costs alone would have been prohibitive. Each B-17 consumed 200 gallons of aviation gas per hour of flight. More fundamentally, the nation was pivoting from war production to peacetime economy. The factories that had built the bombers were retooling for automobiles, refrigerators, and housing materials. The men who had flown them were coming home, eager to forget the cold terror of combat missions and reclaim interrupted civilian lives. There was no mission left that required a 1,000-plane raid, no enemy industrial complex that needed obliterating. The B-17, which had seemed essential 18 months earlier, was now redundant.
The War Assets Administration, tasked with disposing of surplus military equipment, faced a dilemma that was both practical and philosophical. These bombers represented not only material value, but symbolic importance. They were the machines that had won the air war over Germany, the steel shields that had protected the men who brought Hitler to defeat. Simply scrapping them seemed almost sacrilegious, a betrayal of the crews who had trusted them with their lives. Yet keeping them was economically impossible, and selling them intact risked putting advanced military technology into potentially hostile hands. The compromise was brutal in its efficiency. Preserve a few for museums and commemorative purposes, put some in storage against future need, and convert the rest to their raw material value. Thus began one of the largest peacetime scrapping operations in history. At Kingman Army Airfield in Arizona, a facility that covered more than 5,000 acres of desert scrubland, the bombers began arriving in the summer of 1945. They came by the hundreds,
flown in from bases across the United States and Europe, landing one after another in the shimmering heat. By the end of the operation, more than 5,500 aircraft sat at Kingman alone, not just B-17s, but B-24s, B-29s, transports, and trainers. From the air, the field looked like an aluminum graveyard, gleaming rows of aircraft stretching to the horizon, each one a ghost of recent purpose. The men assigned to process them approached the work with a mixture of efficiency and melancholy. Many were veterans who had flown these same models in combat. Now they walked between the silent bombers with clipboards, inventorying parts, marking engines and instruments for salvage, determining which elements could be sold and which would go directly to the smelters. The process was methodical. First, any classified equipment was removed: bomb sights, radio gear, certain instruments.
These items were either retained by the military or destroyed. Next came the valuable components: engines, propellers, landing gear, anything that could be sold to civilian operators or stored for potential military use. The engines alone were worth thousands of dollars each on the secondary market. Then the airframes themselves were assessed. A small number, fewer than 100 out of thousands, were deemed worthy of preservation or sale as intact aircraft. These went to museums, foreign air forces, or civilian operators who could afford the maintenance costs. The rest were marked for scrap. The scrapping itself was almost surgical in its brutality. Crews with cutting torches moved through the bombers, separating aluminum from steel, copper from brass, each material destined for different smelters and recyclers. The aluminum was particularly valuable. The B-17 contained roughly 16,000 pounds of it, and aluminum prices in the immediate post-war period made recovery profitable. The wings came off first, sliced at the fuselage joint and hauled away on flatbed trucks. Then the tail section, the nose, the fuselage cut into manageable pieces. What had taken 13,000 man-hours to assemble was disassembled in less than a day. The recycled aluminum would become pots and pans, window frames, automobile bodies, the material of peacetime prosperity. The steel went to construction, the copper to electrical wiring. Within weeks, a B-17 that had survived missions over Ploiesti and Berlin existed only as raw material in a dozen different forms, its identity erased, its history reduced to a line item in a scrap dealer's ledger. There was something profoundly American in this transformation. The same industrial system that had created the bombers now consumed them, recycling their substance into the machinery of civilian life. It was efficient, practical, unsentimental, the kind of decision that military logistics demands.
Yet for the men who had flown them, the sight of B-17s being cut apart was visceral and painful. Veteran pilot John Howland, visiting Kingman in 1946, later wrote, "I saw them lined up like cattle going to slaughter, and I wanted to weep. These were the machines that had brought us home when everything else said we should die." Navigator Harold Dorfman expressed it differently. "We had names for them: Hell's Angels, Yankee Doodle, Memphis Belle. They weren't things, they were crewmates, and now they were being turned into beer cans." This emotional response reveals something essential about the relationship between men and machines in modern warfare. The B-17 crews had anthropomorphized their bombers because doing so helped them survive psychologically. If the aircraft was just a machine, then its destruction meant nothing. But if it had personality, courage, loyalty, then its survival mattered, and by extension, so did theirs. The bomber became a talisman against chaos, a source of agency in an environment where death was random and control illusory. Scrapping the B-17s was not merely an economic decision, it was the severing of a bond that had been forged in fear and sustained by faith. Yet not all the B-17s went to the scrapyards. A small number found second lives, and these afterlives reveal other dimensions of the aircraft's significance. Several were sold to civilian operators and converted for non-military purposes.
Some became cargo transports, their bomb bays modified to carry freight, their gun turrets removed, their interiors reconfigured for commercial use. They flew routes across the Americas and the Pacific, carrying everything from mail to mining equipment. A few were converted into air-sea rescue aircraft, their bomb bays fitted with droppable lifeboats, patrolling coastlines and saving downed flyers.
Others were sold to foreign governments. The Danish Air Force, the Brazilian Air Force, and others operated B-17s well into the 1950s, using them for maritime patrol and transport. Some of the most unusual conversions involved scientific research. The National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, predecessor to NASA, acquired several B-17s and modified them for high-altitude atmospheric research, engine testing, and flight dynamic studies. These bombers, stripped of their military equipment and fitted with specialized instruments, contributed to post-war advances in aeronautics. One B-17 was converted into a flying laboratory for studying thunderstorm formation. Another was used to test experimental jet engines mounted on its wings. In these roles, the bomber continued to serve, though the nature of that service had transformed entirely. Hollywood, too, found use for the B-17. Several were acquired by film studios and used in war movies throughout the 1950s and 1960s. These aircraft, carefully maintained and flown by veteran pilots, recreated the bombing missions they had actually flown a decade earlier, now for cameras instead of combat. There was something circular and strange in this. Machines of war performing war as entertainment, their violence sanitized and their terror aestheticized. Yet these film appearances helped preserve the B-17's place in American memory, ensuring that subsequent generations would recognize its distinctive silhouette and understand, however imperfectly, what it had meant. A very small number were preserved as museum pieces or memorials. The Memphis Belle, after completing its 25th mission in May 1943, returned to the United States and embarked on a war bond tour. It was eventually placed on display in Memphis, Tennessee, then later moved to the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, where it sits today, meticulously restored.
Other preserved B-17s found homes at the Smithsonian, the Imperial War Museum, and various aviation museums across the United States. These survivors became relics in the most sacred sense, objects imbued with meaning beyond their material form, touchstones for memory and mourning. But these were exceptions. The overwhelming majority of B-17 Flying Fortresses were cut apart and melted down. Of the 12,731 built during the war, fewer than 50 remain in existence today, and only a handful of those are still airworthy. The rest became refrigerators and automobiles, bridges and buildings, the substance of post-war America. They were not abandoned or forgotten, they were transformed, their material value extracted and redeployed. This was not neglect. It was the logical conclusion of a war fought with industrial weapons. When the war ends, the weapons return to industry. The German and Japanese strategists had never fully understood this dimension of American power. They had studied American industrial capacity, noted the factories and resources, calculated production rates and logistical capabilities. But they had not grasped the cultural implications of that abundance. In their military traditions, equipment was precious because it was scarce. A tank, a plane, a ship represented not just material but artisanship, individual craftsmanship, and national honor. These machines were maintained, repaired, and preserved as long as possible because replacing them was difficult. The idea of manufacturing something so well made, so effective, so expensive, and then discarding it when it was no longer immediately useful was almost incomprehensible. Captured German officers, interrogated after the war, expressed astonishment at American logistics. They had known intellectually that the United States outproduced Germany in every category of war material.
But seeing it in practice, seeing bombers treated as disposable, seeing entire airfields full of aircraft marked for scrap, drove home a deeper truth. One Luftwaffe general touring an American disposal facility in 1946 remarked through an interpreter, "We fought as if every plane was irreplaceable. You fought as if every plane was replaceable." The comment was bitter, but accurate. American military doctrine, enabled by American industrial capacity, treated weapons as consumable resources. If something broke, you replaced it. If something became obsolete, you discarded it. There was always more. This abundance was not merely quantitative, it was philosophical. It reflected a society organized around production and consumption, innovation and obsolescence. The same culture that would create planned obsolescence in consumer goods, that would replace last year's car model with this year's, that would tear down buildings only decades old to construct something newer. That culture treated the B-17 not as an irreplaceable artifact, but as a tool that had served its purpose. The bomber was extraordinary, but it was not sacred. It could be honored in memory while being recycled in fact. The Japanese military leadership had encountered similar cognitive dissonance. Japanese industrial planning emphasized quality over quantity, craftsmanship over mass production. Their aircraft were often superior in individual performance, lighter, more maneuverable, with longer range. But when losses mounted, they could not replace them quickly enough. American factories, by contrast, produced aircraft in staggering numbers, accepting that some would be mediocre, some would be destroyed, some would become obsolete before they saw combat. The system absorbed these losses and kept producing.
Lieutenant General Torashiro Kawabe, Vice Chief of the Imperial Japanese Army General Staff, said after the war, "We calculated your productivity, but we did not understand what it meant to fight a nation that could waste so much and still win." There is irony here, deep and historical. The B-17, designed to embody permanence and strength, a flying fortress, proved most effective as a temporary instrument, powerful precisely because it could be produced in numbers sufficient to absorb catastrophic losses and then discarded when no longer needed. Its strength was not individual invincibility, but systemic replaceability. This was the logic of total war in the industrial age. Victory came not from perfect weapons, but from sufficient weapons, not from preserving resources, but from overwhelming opposition with material that could be continuously regenerated. Yet there remains something melancholy in the image of those Arizona scrapyards, the endless rows of bombers awaiting dismantlement. Each aircraft represented not just material and labor, but human stories. The B-17 that brought a crew home after its hydraulics were shot out over Münster, landing without brakes and careening off the runway. That bomber saved 10 lives. The one that took 350 flak holes over Berlin and still made it to emergency landing field on the coast, that one saved 10 more. Multiply these stories by thousands of missions, and the emotional weight becomes immense. These were not just machines. They were witnesses to courage and terror, to the best and worst of human experience at 25,000 feet in hostile sky. Some veterans could not bear to see them destroyed. Small groups formed, attempting to preserve individual bombers, or at least photograph them before they vanished. These were grassroots efforts, usually underfunded and understaffed, motivated purely by the conviction that something essential would be lost if all the B-17s disappeared.
In a few cases, they succeeded. A bomber would be purchased for a few $1,000s and painstakingly restored. More often they failed, arriving at disposal facilities only to find that the aircraft they'd hoped to save had been scrapped the previous week. The market value of aluminum exceeded the sentimental value of history, and in the economy of 1946 America, sentiment lost. The civilians who bought scrap aluminum from the disposal yards had no sense of what they were purchasing. They saw metal, measured in tons and priced per pound. The fact that this particular aluminum had flown through skies full of anti-aircraft fire, that it had carried men who prayed and cursed and sometimes died inside it, was irrelevant to the transaction. This disconnection between material and meaning is characteristic of modern economies, where commodities circulate stripped of context. The aluminum that became a refrigerator in a Detroit kitchen had no memory of the mission over Schweinfurt. The steel that reinforced a highway overpass in California retained no knowledge of the bomb bay doors it once formed. The transformation was complete and irreversible.
And yet, memory persisted. The veterans remembered. They formed associations, the 8th Air Force Historical Society, the mighty 8th Air Force Heritage Museum, countless smaller groups organized around specific bomb groups or squadrons. They gathered annually, these old men who had been young warriors, and they told stories. They remembered the names of bombers and the men who flew them. They recreated formations and bombing runs with model aircraft, traced routes on maps, argued about which approach had been best to Regensburg, or whether the Schweinfurt raid had been worth the losses. They kept the memory alive through ritual and repetition, because the bombers themselves were gone, and memory was all that remained. Their children and grandchildren listened with varying degrees of comprehension. To those who had not experienced the war, the B-17 was a historical curiosity, impressively large in photographs, but ultimately just another old airplane. The emotional charge that the veterans felt, the visceral connection between survival and machinery, did not transmit easily across generations. This is the fate of all war material. It becomes historical artifact, museum piece, eventually curio, its original purpose fading into abstraction. The few B-17s that still fly at air shows are marvels of restoration, impeccably maintained and beautiful to see. But they are not the same machines that fought over Germany. They are replicas of themselves, performing history rather than making it. In the end, the question of why so many B-17 Flying Fortresses were scrapped after the war admits multiple answers, each true in its own dimension. The economic answer is straightforward. Maintaining them was too expensive, and their material value exceeded their functional utility in peacetime. The strategic answer is equally clear. The nature of warfare was changing. Jet engines were rendering piston engine bombers obsolete, and the military needed to invest in new technologies rather than preserve old ones. The cultural answer is more complex. American society was eager to move beyond the war, to forget the trauma and embrace prosperity, and the bombers were reminders of a period everyone wanted to leave behind. But beneath these pragmatic explanations lies a deeper truth about the relationship between democracies and their instruments of war. Dictatorships fetishize military hardware, enshrining weapons as symbols of national power and preserving them long after their useful life has ended. Democracies, by contrast, treat weapons as tools, necessary during conflict, disposable afterward. This is not disrespect. It is a different kind of respect, one that honors purpose over form, function over symbolism. The B-17 was built to win a war. It did. Its job was complete.
Preserving every bomber would have been sentimental indulgence, a denial of the very pragmatism that had made victory possible. There is freedom in this approach, a kind of ideological confidence. Nations that must preserve their weapons to maintain legitimacy are nations uncertain of their foundations. Nations that can scrap their weapons when the threat passes are nations secure enough to believe that their strength lies not in accumulated materiel, but in the capacity to produce materiel when needed. The United States could afford to destroy 12,000 bombers because it believed, rightly or not, that if another threat emerged, it could build 12,000 more. This confidence, whether justified or hubristic, was itself a form of deterrence, a message to potential adversaries that American power was not finite but generative, not fixed but flowing. The B-17 Flying Fortress, then, serves as a strange kind of monument, not to its own permanence, but to its expendability, not to individual heroism, but to systemic capacity. It represented the moment when industrial warfare reached a kind of apex, when the ability to produce overwhelming quantities of increasingly complex machines determined the outcome of global conflict. The bomber was an extraordinary achievement of engineering, metallurgy, and organizational logistics, and it was disposable. These facts are not contradictory. They define each other. On certain summer evenings in the American Southwest,
when the light slants just right across the desert, you can still see traces of where the storage yards once stood. The concrete hardstands remain, cracked and weathered but persistent. Pieces of metal occasionally surface from the sand, a fragment of aluminum skin, a section of control cable, a rivet still holding nothing together. These are the only physical remnants of the thousands of bombers that once sat here, waiting for the cutting torches.
The men who flew them are mostly gone now, passed away in the decades since the war. Their stories persist in oral histories and memoirs, in the archives of museums and historical societies, and the few remaining airworthy B-17s still fly, carefully maintained by dedicated volunteers, appearing at air shows where crowds gather to watch these relics take to the sky. The sound of 4 Wright Cyclone engines at full power is unmistakable, a deep, rhythmic thunder that carries across airfields and makes old men stop and listen, transported for a moment to English runways in 1944, to cold mornings and dangerous skies. But these are echoes, not presences. The overwhelming majority of B-17 Flying Fortresses exist now only as transformation, the physical substance of war converted into the material substrate of peace. They are the aluminum in 1,000 different products, the steel in forgotten structures, the raw materials that were extracted, refined, shaped into instruments of precision violence, and then returned to the cycle of industrial metabolism. In this way, they remain part of the landscape, invisible but present, their matter persisting even as their form has vanished. There is a kind of poetry in this dissolution, a recognition that even the most powerful instruments of human will are temporary, that metal returns to commerce, and memory returns to earth. The B-17 was built to endure, but its true legacy lies not in endurance, but in transformation, from production line to combat, from combat to disposal, from disposal to reincarnation as the ordinary objects of civilian life. It saved democracy not once, but twice, first by helping to defeat fascism, then by surrendering its substance to build the prosperity that followed. And perhaps that is the deepest answer to why so many were scrapped. They were needed desperately. Then they were needed not at all. And in both moments, they served.
They were loved fiercely by the men whose lives depended on them, then forgotten by the society that had built them. And in both states, they fulfilled their purpose. They were fortresses of aluminum and courage in the sky, and then they were refrigerators and automobiles on the ground. And in both forms, they embodied the same truth, that freedom is not preserved by monuments, but by the willingness to use, sacrifice, and ultimately relinquish the tools that defend it. The sky over Arizona is empty now, where once it was filled with steel wings. The concrete has cracked, the metal has melted, the men have aged and died. But the story remains, inscribed not in bronze plaques or marble monuments, but in the invisible persistence of matter transformed, in every piece of aluminum that once flew through flak-filled skies, and now sits quietly, anonymously, in the ordinary infrastructure of peace.